Hi. Thank you for the introduction. As Polly said, I'm Mikko Jimenez. I'm a graduate student at CSU, and I'm presenting some work today that was, done by me, but also I'm advised by Dr. Leva Pachar and Dr. Sarah Reed over at CSU. So before I get started, I just want to introduce myself a little bit. I'm a master's student, as I've said a couple times now, in the Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology department at CSU. I'm a birder. I'm an avid birder, have been since high school, so that's something that has really shaped a lot of my research interests. And I identify as an urban ecologist, and what that means is I'm really interested in the wildlife that is in our cities. So, oftentimes when we think about ecology, ecological research, we think about going out and studying going out to these pristine wildlife areas that haven't been touched by humans. And I think specifically here on the Front Range, we think about going out into the mountains to be, surrounded by these kind of natural areas. But my question really is, as a researcher, is how are wildlife species adapting to the cities that we live in? So I'm really interested in kind of human-dominated ecosystems. So with that in mind, I actually think that I could rename this talk why I think the Front Range of Colorado is such an interesting place to study conservation. I think oftentimes, like I said, we think of all the nature in Colorado as being like over the Front Range, but I think where we live and where a lot of us live here in Colorado is a really interesting place ecologically and just in terms of what we're doing with conservation. So that being said, the world is urbanizing, and this presents a number of challenges for us as conservationists. More than half of all people today live in cities. A lot of us, I think, in the room came from either Fort Collins or Denver, which are both urban environments. And that number is expected to go up to 2/3 of the population by the year 2050. So the world's urbanizing, and this presents both ecological and social challenges for us, right? Because ecologically, we know that urban development tends to fragment or, degrade habitat. But also, socially, it leads to people having less access to natural areas. And this is a big problem because it could lead to kind of problems garnering public support for conservation initiatives. So these are two things that we need to think about as the world urbanizes. This is not by any means just a global problem. This is very much a local problem, right? Colorado is one of the fastest growing places in the country. And in particular, the Front Range of Colorado is, one of the fastest growing, or is the fastest growing region in the state. So we kind of live in this, this place that's urbanizing really rapidly. And as conservationists, this is something that we need to think about. And just to illustrate this point, this is a picture of Fort Collins in 1937 that I found from CSU's library or archives. You can see, there are some major roads for sure. There are some buildings, but if you compare it to a similar picture taken in 2018, you can see it's a lot more built up. This is a hugely different thing, a lot more impervious surface, a lot more, building density is a lot higher. We often I think it's cool to study conservation here because, we're a very local example of a global conservation problem. And while I think that initially kind of sounds like a negative thing, I actually think I see it as an opportunity because I think that here in Colorado, we're attacking this problem in a lot of different ways. And if we can kind of figure out how to deal with these problems, there are a lot of implications for global conservation. So this is one reason why I think it's really cool to study conservation here. So I work in Fort Collins on the Nature in the City initiative, and this initiative is really it's our strategic plan, or Fort Collins' strategic plan for how to deal with rapid urbanization. And specifically, the vision that the city has is a connected open space network accessible to the entire community that provides a variety of experiences and functional habitat for people, plants, and wildlife. And what I really want to highlight about this vision, and why I think it's a really cool vision to have, is this people, plants, and wildlife thing. So we recognize that there are both ecological and social challenges, and we want to combat both of those in one kind of overarching strategic plan, which I think is really cool, and is not not always common among some conservation plans. Specifically, what the initiative looks to focus on, so some kind of concrete goals, are having all the residents in Fort Collins within a 10-minute walking distance to nature or some type of natural area. And this is really important because in a lot of developed cities, we know that green space is not equally distributed across the city, and this leads to a lot of communities not having access to green space, which again points back to that social problem that I talked about. So that's something that we are cognizant of and looking to focus on. We also want to focus on having connected habitat for wildlife. So it's very well documented in the literature that if wildlife can kind of move around the city, they're much more likely to persist and be able to adapt to changes. So if we can kind of create and use city planning to create a connected open space or a connected green space, or I guess a connected habitat around the city, then we can hopefully allow wildlife to be able to adapt to some of the changes that are taking place. And lastly, we want to focus on land stewardship. So we want to engage, the residents of Fort Collins in shifting the landscape of Fort Collins to be something that more closely resembles the native habitat that was here. So really like shortgrass prairie, which I'll talk about more in a second. So this means, planting native vegetation and hopefully providing habitat for some native wildlife. So this is a second reason why I think it's really cool to work here in the system that I work in. These are really innovative ways of thinking about conservation and really strategic ways about thinking about conservation specifically in response to urbanization. So I think we on the Front Range here, we really value nature. A lot of us use it for recreation, for hiking, biking, birding, and as a result of that, we're seeking creative ways to protect it. And I think it's really cool to be working with, people who support what I do in that way. So as I mentioned, the Nature in the City overall initiative has a number of programs that are associated with it. So there are different projects that basically work towards the goal of the overarching initiative. For my master's work, I focused on two of these projects, one of which was the Certified Natural Areas program, which I'll talk about a lot today. It's an urban habitat enhancement program. And the other is a biodiversity project, which is a citizen science monitoring program. I'm not going to focus too much on that one today, but I'm happy to answer questions. If any of you are interested in citizen science, I'm happy to talk more about that. So as I mentioned, I'll be talking mostly about the Certified Natural Areas program, which is an urban habitat enhancement program that the city runs. And before I get into the specifics of the Certified Natural Areas program, I want to talk about what an urban habitat enhancement program is. So, here on the Front Range, we typically have, we divide Colorado kind of up into eastern Colorado and western Colorado. So there's originally there was a lot of shortgrass prairie up until you got into the foothills, right? And what we did when we developed on those areas is we kind of fragmented a lot of that habitat. And what that tends to do in a lot of ecosystems is push a lot of the native wildlife and native plants out. So the idea behind an urban habitat enhancement program is that if we can kind of rewild these cities, if we can kind of plant native vegetation, we can hope to provide some habitat for native wildlife. So that's the general idea, and there are a number of programs that I'd say fall under this type of this category of conservation program. One of which that I always like to plug when I can is the Habitat Heroes program, which is run by the Audubon Rockies. So this program looks to basically plant, like I just said, plant natives and plant native gardens in the hopes that it'll provide habitat for local wildlife. And yeah, I think it's a very cool program. So if any of you guys are interested in that, I'm happy to talk more about it. Even though I don't run it or I'm not directly affiliated with it, I think it's a really cool program. But I focused on a local program called the Certified Natural Areas program. And again, it's run by the Nature in the City initiative. And the general goal is to protect, restore, and enhance native animal and plant communities. And really what this program does is it engages private landowners, most of which are homeowners associations, and it tries to incentivize them to be stewards of, of Fort Collins, and basically to plant native vegetation in the hopes that it will provide habitat for wildlife. So that's the idea behind this program. My research questions as an urban ecologist were, a lot of these programs are relatively new and don't necessarily have resources to assess how well they're doing. So as Polly mentioned, a lot of my questions were regarding how well this program actually works. So specifically, I wanted to ask, does the Certified Natural Areas program enhance native plant communities? And then relatedly, does that in turn lead to enhancement for bird and butterfly communities? So that's my main question. And to do this, I surveyed 10 residential open spaces. So these are privately owned sites that are residential, and typically they were homeowners associations, the kind of communal areas within those, but they were not enrolled in the program, so these were not certified natural areas. In contrast, I surveyed 10 certified natural areas. So these are very similar in that they're privately owned, privately managed, and usually occurred on homeowners associations. But these sites were enrolled in the program. And then lastly, I surveyed 12 city-owned natural areas. So these are owned by the city, managed by the city. They're open to public recreation. And these are the types of natural areas that I think you guys have here around Denver too, and all over the Front Range. And specifically what we looked at those 32 sites was we looked at vegetation. So we looked at the number of native species that we saw at each site, the percentage of native cover that we saw at each site. We conducted point counts to look at what bird species occur on each of those sites. And then we also conducted pollard walks to look at what butterfly species occurred on each of these sites. So I'm gonna kind of go over some of my results here, and to denote what I'm talking about, there will be a picture in the upper right-hand corner. So if you see this common sunflower, I'm talking about vegetation. If you see this barn swallow, I'm talking about birds. And if you see this common wood nymph, I'm talking about butterflies. So in terms of native plant communities, we saw a surprising diversity of native plants across the city. At our 32 sites, we saw 46 native plant species. This includes things like this common sunflower, a bunch of different types of milkweeds, which are really good for butterflies and different pollinators, things like spiderwort. So we saw a lot of really cool native plant species. One kind of concrete thing that we saw that the program accomplishes really well is that it reduces the amount of mowed vegetation. So at our residential sites, residential open spaces, we saw something that looked a lot more like this. So some spaces that were mowed down a lot, and out of the certified natural areas, we saw something more like the right-hand picture where things weren't mowed down. And this is important, even though it may seem really minor. We know that even things like vegetative structure can have huge effects on local wildlife. So this is a really cool finding. In terms of birds, we saw 64 species at our 32 sites. This included some common species that you might expect to see in an urban setting, things like robins or grackles or red-winged blackbirds. But we also saw a number of what we call human-sensitive species. So these are things like blue-winged teal, osprey, Bullock's oriole, yellow warblers. And these are species that, as their name suggests, the past research has shown that they're really sensitive to urban development. So we actually saw more of these human-sensitive species at the certified natural areas than at residential open spaces. So this suggests that, to some degree, the program provides good habitat for some of these species that would otherwise be pushed out of the city. And then in terms of butterflies, we saw 18 different species that ranged from a bunch of different families, including a number of different skippers, a number of different blues, swallowtails, common wood nymphs. And I think our most exciting finding, which I thought was really cool, is that we found that butterfly species richness is tightly correlated with the number of native plants that we saw at a site. So this suggests, and this, there are other research papers that have shown this. This is not necessarily anything new, but that native plants are able to support higher numbers of butterfly richness. So this is really exciting. And I just want to say, like, my field research was really fun. I didn't necessarily expect to see the incredible diversity that I saw within the city limits of Fort Collins, but I did. I saw a lot of really cool species, and this is another reason why I think it's really cool to study conservation here, because there's an incredible amount of diversity in our own backyards here on the Front Range that I think we often overlook. And I think it's important to both celebrate them, but also recognize that, as Fort Collins grows, we should be looking to protect a lot of these species, and that's very important. So just to kind of go over what, again, my research findings were, we found that certified natural areas reduced the amount of mowed vegetation. They also housed more human-sensitive bird species that might otherwise be pushed out of the city. And we also found that butterfly communities were strongly influenced by native vegetation. So those are, kind of important things to recognize as the Front Range grows. So to get back to my original point, why I think it's cool to study, why it's really incredible to study conservation here on the Front Range, I mentioned a number of reasons that I think we're a local example of a global problem, and that we're really working hard to fix those things. And I hope to get across, and I don't think that this audience necessarily needs too much convincing, that the next time you think about nature, you don't necessarily think, off into the mountains. You don't think about having to go out there, because there is a lot of really cool stuff and a lot of really ecological complex relationships going on here right in our own backyards. And I think it's going to be, like I said, I think it's going to be really important to keep that in mind and to protect it. And I think that's going to come down to how much public support we have for doing things like that. I think conservation by nature is kind of a communal effort. And that's kind of my big reason of why I like working here, is because of people like you, who just by coming to this talk, you show that you value wildlife species. And I think that's, I've worked on conservation projects in a number of different places, and I don't think I've ever had so much public support in the way that I do here on the Front Range. So I think that's going to be a really useful tool for us as conservationists. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you guys. I'd like to thank all of my funding sources, but in particular, I'd like to thank the Lois Webster Fund for specifically for providing the resources for a research assistant this last summer, Dr. Kate Wilkins. She took one for the team and helped me out for a whole summer, even though she could have been looking for jobs after she just finished her PhD. So she really helped me out, and you guys provided the resources to help compensate her for her time. And she was, an integral part of this this project. So in turn, you guys were. So thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions, and I should also add, I have a number of figures that kind of lay out some of the relationships that I talked about later in this talk. So yeah, thank you all so much. Happy to take.
Mikko, does your research include identifying collaborative opportunities with other universities in other states?
It's a good question. So it's not like the focus of my research, but I know that a lot of these efforts, specifically birds and butterflies, actually, are migratory species, and they take collaborative efforts like that. I know that the city is somewhat interested in getting involved in that, but yeah, it's not really the focus of my research. But I think that is a very important thing to consider, especially on the Front Range.
Could it benefit what you're doing?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, a number of the species that I saw and that I found that were a big part of my research, like I said, they migrate. So they likely move around the Front Range, and it's a much bigger problem than just like Fort Collins can really contribute to. So yeah.
How difficult has it been for Fort Collins to convince homeowners associations to create certified natural areas?
It's a good question. Yeah. So it's funny. When I talked to the program director, the way that a lot of these homeowners associations, so I should say, let me back up. There are two categories that a lot of them fall into. One is that they actively sought out the program, so they thought, they heard about it and they wanted to get involved. The other is very different in that they'll get a citation from the Fort Collins, for they're not cutting the grass, basically. And one of the options, rather than because one thing that if you're enrolled in the program, you're exempt from that citation. Yeah, so it's a funny way to get people involved. But you know, like I said, even things like not mowing your lawn or not mowing your grass in these cases can provide a lot of benefits to certain wildlife. So you know, it's a low-hanging fruit that I think is really cool to get people involved in a conservation initiative.
Instead of not mowing the yard, can you encourage them to use buffalo grass, which uses less water and only needs to be mowed now, not as often?
I mean, yeah, that's.
Or just let it go free, wild.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, yeah. I wasn't super involved in like the creation of the program, but yeah, that's definitely something that we could think about.
So tell us a little bit about the grasses that did occur in the certified areas.
Yeah. So one thing I should note is, we didn't actually see. Wait, is this the right one? I should say I'm still running some of these analyses and thinking about that, but we didn't see statistically significantly different like native communities between our residential open, and these are the wrong labels, but across our different site types. So that's actually one thing that I want to note about the program is like we didn't find evidence to suggest that it's super successful at shifting to having more natives, more native vegetation. So that's one thing that they might need to, you know, maybe enforce more strongly or find better ways to incentivize that specifically. So yeah, that's one area where the program can definitely improve, I guess. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
The butterflies, I mean, did you do that on site only, or did you go out and actually capture them as well too?
We caught them when we could. There are a number of species that I think we could identify by sight, but there are some that are much more difficult and you have to get them down. So we caught a good amount of them.
So then a follow-up question, in that capturing process or anything else, do you ever have, taking a look at the other insect population that was around there that could be food sources and everything else, do you ever kind of just take a look at that and see if there's a correlation just besides just the butterflies themselves?
Yeah. No, we didn't. That's a really good idea. But that's not really something that we looked at. We did look at things like floral, so a lot of the butterflies that we're looking at are like nectar dependent. So we did look at things like floral activity and if that was influencing butterfly species, and to some degree it was. Yeah, we didn't look at too much at other insects. Yeah.
Are these areas irrigated or is it all based on natural precipitation?
There's some degree of, I guess it's mostly, most of the Poudre runs through Fort Collins, but there isn't too much, at least at the sites that I was at, there wasn't too much irrigation. That's a good question. I'm not, I don't know site by site. There are definitely some sites that had irrigation ditches running near them, but I don't know if they're actually relying on that water.
I was thinking a lot of times native vegetation takes less water.
Yeah.
A lot of times, the economic savings of not irrigating can be a big factor to transfer from traditional bluegrass lawns to native vegetation. Because again, water is getting more expensive. Yeah. Yeah, I think water is going to be a huge issue for things like this.
All right, let's get rid of it.
Thanks, guys.